guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be continuing learning about the human respiratory system. We just have two objectives for this video. We're going to be talking about the breathing process and we're going to be looking at common diseases of the respiratory system. So first, let's begin. If you guys remember, if you didn't watch my first video, make sure to watch it. We said that breathing, okay, so breathing is what type of process? It's a mechanical process, okay? So it's a mechanical process. And we have two types, okay? We have either inhalation or inspiration versus exhalation or expiration, okay? So what happens, what are the muscles that move, or what are the factors that are related to the lungs that move when we inhale versus when we exhale? If you remember before in our first video, we said that the lungs, okay, we have two factors that allow them to move, change their volume, okay? We have the internal intercostal muscles, okay? And we said, remember, there's two types. We have external intercostal muscles and we have internal intercostal muscles, and we'll be looking at them right now. And we also have the diaphragm, okay? So those are the two factors that we said are related to the breathing process. This is the diaphragm here, okay? So this is the diaphragm, and that's when it's at rest, okay? And now we'll be looking at what happens when we want to breathe in and we want to exhale. And I didn't draw the ribs, but the ribs surround the lungs over here, okay? And we have muscles in between them, and those are the intercostal muscles. So let's look first at inhalation. So I want you guys to follow me. If you put your hands on your chest, on your ribs, and inhale, what do you feel? You feel that your ribs are moving outward and upward, and that's a result of what? We have our external, pay attention, it's our external intercostal muscles contract. So when these contract, what happens? We said our rib cage, if you want, do it again. You see, it moves upward and outward. Rib cage moves upward and outward, okay? And then our intercostal muscles are relaxed, okay? And then our diaphragm contracts. So we said the diaphragm here is when it's at rest. So when it contracts, we call this shape, when it's at rest, a dome shape. When it contracts, it's going to get pulled down and it's gonna become flat. So what happens if this dome shape is contracting, is going down, becoming flat? Our rib cage is moving upward and outward. What happens? So we're increasing what? The volume, okay? So this plus the contraction of the diaphragm turning it into a flat shape, the result is what? Increases the volume of our thoracic cavity. So increases volume of thoracic cavity. And now, what do you guys know about the relationship between volume and pressure? Volume and pressure are inversely proportional. So volume, if volume increases, what happens to pressure? Pressure decreases. So this is very important to know. So we increase the volume of the thoracic cavity. Immediately, if we increase the volume, what happens to the pressure inside the lungs? The pressure inside the lungs decreases. So now what happens? The pressure in the environment. So now we have pressure from the environment, or pressure in the environment, okay, the atmospheric pressure is higher than the pressure inside our thoracic cavity. So what will happen? Of course, air will move inside the lungs. It moves down a concentration gradient. So we're gonna write air then moves down a pressure concentration gradient. So down a pressure concentration gradient. What does down a pressure concentration gradient mean? It goes from high pressure to low pressure. And we saw why. So let's just quickly repeat it. We said when we inhale, okay, our rib cage are moving upward and outward as a result of what? As a result of the contraction of our external intercostal muscles, and our internal intercostal muscles are relaxed, then what happens to the diaphragm? The diaphragm contracts also. It moves from a dome shape into a flat shape. What does that do? That increases the volume in the thoracic cavity. If the volume in the thoracic cavity increases, what happens to the pressure inside? The pressure decreases. Now we have a higher pressure from the environment, and so air will move down the pressure concentration gradient. Why is it down and not against? Down because it goes from a high pressure, which is in the environment, into a lower pressure, which is in our lungs. Okay? Now the process just reverses when we talk about exhalation. Let me just erase for you guys. Okay, let's just erase here. We're just gonna look at what happens when we exhale. Okay? So when we exhale, what's happening? As you guys can see, the external intercostal muscles are what? Are relaxing, while the internal intercostal muscles contract. But usually, when do they contract? During a forced exhalation. Okay, so when I'm basically forcing myself to exhale, I'm trying to exhale, that's when my internal intercostal muscles contract. Now, when my internal intercostal muscles contract, what happens to my rib cage? Breathe in, you find your rib cage moving upward and outward. Now breathe out, you see it shrinks. So what happens? It moves inward and downward. Okay? So our rib cage, when our internal intercostal muscles contract and our external intercostal muscles relax, our rib cage will move inward and downward. Now what will happen to the volume? So think about it. When we were inhaling, our volume was increasing. Now we're exhaling. My ribs are moving inward and downward. So the volume inside, and sorry, forgot to mention, the diaphragm relaxes. It also relaxes, so it keeps its dome shape, to what also decreases the volume of the thoracic cavity. So volume decreases of the thoracic cavity. Now again, what is the relationship between volume and pressure? They are inversely proportional. So the volume decreases, what happens to the pressure? The pressure inside the thoracic cavity increases. Now we have a high pressure inside our thoracic cavity. It's higher than the pressure in the environment. Now what did we say? Air always moves down a pressure concentration gradient. So it's gonna move from a place that has high pressure to a place that has low pressure. Okay? So high pressure is where? Is inside the thoracic cavity. Low pressure is where? Is in the environment. So when we exhale, the volume of the thoracic cavity decreases, we have higher pressure, so air will move out of our thoracic cavity into the environment. Okay? And that's mainly it for the breathing process. Okay? Now, if you also want to look at the air content between inhaled air versus exhaled air. Okay? So, of course, remember, we said, why do we breathe? Why do we have breathing? We said it's because of cellular respiration. Our cells perform cellular respiration to produce energy. And what was our reactant? Let's write the equation again. So I'm gonna write it over here as C6H12O6 plus 6O2 gives energy plus 6H2O plus 6CO2. Okay, so we have oxygen as a reactant. Where do we get that oxygen from? We said we get that through breathing, inhalation, and we said CO2 is bad. So how do we make it exit our body? Through exhalation. So that was just a reminder for why we breathe. Okay, so if we want to look at the air content, of course, the inhaled air will include more what? Higher oxygen than the exhaled air. So for example, this is 4%, and then this would be, for example, 0.04. Okay, so of course, the oxygen content in our inhaled air would be more than the exhaled air. Now, if we look at CO2, of course, inhaled will have a lower content of CO2, exhaled will have a higher content. Why? Because CO2 is produced as a byproduct in cellular respiration, and we want it to exit our body, so it will have a high content of CO2 in our exhaled air. Now nitrogen is found 78% in the atmosphere, so it's going to be the same between the inhaled and the exhaled. Now the temperature. For the inhaled air, the temperature and the humidity, so how moist the air is, it depends on the environment we're in, okay? However, for the exhaled air, the temperature is around 37. Why? Because that's the temperature of our body inside, and it has a high humidity, it's moist. We said, remember, if you still remember from our first video about the respiratory tract, we said that we have thin and moist walls, okay? So that's why it has high humidity, high content of humidity for our air content when it is exhaled, okay? So now let's move and look about some definitions that we have to know, okay? So the first definition we have to know is the tidal volume. Now what is the tidal volume? It's very simple. It's basically the volume of air either inhaled or exhaled during each breath at rest. So right now, while I'm speaking to you guys, I'm breathing. That is my tidal volume. I'm not trying to force an inhalation, neither am I trying to force an exhalation. That's just my constant rate at rest, the amount of volume of air that I inhale or I exhale. Okay, that is the tidal volume. Now, if I want to look at the vital capacity is the maximum volume exhaled after a maximum inhalation. So for example, I force myself to reach a maximum inhalation, and then the volume that I exhale is my vital capacity, okay? Now, if you want to move to residual volume, this is very important to know. So what is the residual volume? Residual volume is just the volume of air that remains in the lungs even after a forced exhalation. So even after I force myself to exhale as much air as possible, there is always going to be a certain volume of air that does not leave the lungs. If that leaves the lungs, that would be catastrophic. It cannot leave the lungs. The lungs need to have, even if it's a very small volume of air inside, and that's what we call the residual volume. And finally, another definition. Please guys, make sure you know all of them. And final thing, we're going to be looking at total lung capacity. What is the total lung capacity? It's basically the vital capacity. Remember, vital capacity, maximum volume exhaled after a max inhalation, plus the residual volume, which is the volume that remains in the lungs even after a forced exhalation. And what does that represent? It represents the volume of air after a maximum inhalation, okay? Because this could be the vice versa too, okay? Those are the definitions that we have to know. And I added a small note for you guys about physical activity, okay? That's one factor that affects our breathing, how fast we breathe, how deep we breathe, what happens in that change. So let's say we're working out, okay? We're performing a sport, or I'm in the gym, I'm having high physical activity. When I have high physical activity, what does my body need? Of course, it needs more energy. Now, where did we say that our cells get this energy from, or our tissues and organs? They get it through cellular respiration, okay? Cellular respiration is what produces energy for our body. So as you guys can see, we have an increased rate of cellular respiration because we need more energy. Now, an increased rate of cellular respiration, what's going to happen to the CO2 content of our body? It's going to increase. So we have a high CO2 content now. We said CO2, what will it do to the pH? It will decrease the pH. Now, if the pH of our blood is low, our center in our brain will directly detect that. So we have a center in our brain that detects the change in pH, and it's directly going to start sending nerve impulses to what? To our external intercostal muscles and to our diaphragm to do what? To start breathing in more air. That's why we increase our breathing rate. So what do we have? We have faster breathing and we have deeper breathing. Now what's the difference between those two? Faster is when I have more breaths per minute. So I'm breathing more per minute. However, deeper breathing, it's when I inhale a larger volume of air, okay? So let's write it down. So deeper is larger volume of air, okay? While faster is just more breaths per minute, okay? But that both of them occur when we want to increase our respiration, because our brain, our body detects a drop in the pH, okay? So that's mainly it for everything you need to know about the breathing process. Now we're going to be looking at some diseases of the respiratory system. So what are some diseases of the respiratory system? We have two mainly common ones, are pneumonia and the common cold, okay? So the common cold, let's start with the common cold. It's just basically a viral infection, affects our upper respiratory tract. So for example, our nose, our throat, our pharynx, okay? And what are the symptoms of it? Runny nose, cough, sore throat, okay? We've all had a common cold before. Now if I look at pneumonia, okay? Pneumonia, what does it mainly affect? It mainly affects the alveoli. And what did we say occurs in the alveoli? Gas exchange. So if I have a problem in my alveoli, there's a problem with the gas exchange. So, and we're gonna see that in the symptoms right now, okay? So, pneumonia affects our alveoli. What type of infection? It could either be a bacterial infection, so by some sort of bacteria, and or by a viral infection. Now what happens? The alveoli become inflamed, okay? They become inflamed and they will fill up with fluid. Now if those air spaces, remember we said alveoli, they're the main site of gas exchange, okay? If these fill up with fluid, then we'll have reduced air spaces, okay? If we have reduced spaces for air, so less gas exchange is going to occur, so it's going to affect our gas exchange. So what will be some symptoms? Of course, we're going to have a cough, we're going to have a fever, we're also going to have some chest pain. Now some treatments for pneumonia could be a vaccine or usually antibiotics, but antibiotics only given to treat what? Bacterial infections and not viral infections. Now, we're also going to be looking at another factor that causes diseases in our respiratory system, and those are the tobacco related. So if anyone watching this video is smoking or knows someone who smokes, I think after you watch this, you're going to want to stop smoking. So what are some diseases that are related to tobacco? So we said smoking, okay? So now when I smoke, for example, cigarettes or a vape or IQOS or any of those new methods of smoking, if we want to say, what do they contain? Okay, so they contain tar. The cigarettes contain, or anything tobacco related contains tar, contains nicotine, contains carbon monoxide, okay, and it also contains, of course, smoke particles. Okay? Now, before we directly look at the factors and what each one of them does, tobacco related to smoking or anything related to smoking can cause what? It can cause COPD, which we'll be looking at later on. It's basically chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It can also cause heart diseases, it can cause heart attacks, it can even cause lung cancer, okay? And we're going to be looking at what happens in those diseases, okay? So let's get back to smoking or anything tobacco related. Contains tar, nicotine, smoke particles, and carbon monoxide. Now what is tar? Tar is the carcinogenic compound, okay? So carcinogenic compound. Now what does carcinogenic compound means? Anything that you see is carcinogenic, what does it mean? Causes cancer, okay? So, yep, you guys heard it? Smoking does cause lung cancer. So because of tar, which is a carcinogenic compound, and that causes cancer. Now what is nicotine? Nicotine is the addictive substance that is found in cigarettes. Okay, that's why people find it really hard to stop smoking, because of nicotine, which is the addictive substance. Now carbon monoxide. Now what is the problem with carbon monoxide? Carbon monoxide, what does it do? It binds to hemoglobin, okay? And what do we know about hemoglobin? What's the function of hemoglobin? Hemoglobin transports, we're gonna put it in small parentheses, transports what? Transports, I wrote it wrong, transports oxygen to our cells and our tissues, okay? Now, the problem comes, carbon monoxide, which is CO, it will bind to hemoglobin instead of oxygen. So hemoglobin is not transporting oxygen anymore, it's transporting carbon monoxide. So there's going to be less oxygen being delivered to our tissues and our cells, which is of course not healthy for us. And finally, we have smoke particles, okay? Now what do those smoke particles do? They basically irritate our lungs, okay? And they also cause inflammation of our lungs. Cause inflammation of our lungs, okay? And since when our lungs get inflamed, they secrete a large amount of mucus. That's why you see they have sometimes, it's called a smoker cough. You can know from someone coughing if it's a smoker cough or not. So I'm just going to erase this part so I can write more about the other related diseases. So hold on a minute with me. If you want, skip a bit from the video or go grab your snack quickly. So let's look at the COPD, which I mentioned before. Okay, so COPD. Now what does it stand for? It stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, okay? So I'm just gonna write it down for you guys. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, okay? And there are two main diseases that fall under this category. They are chronic bronchitis, okay, and emphysema, okay? Those two are the main diseases that fall under COPD. Now what is chronic bronchitis? Now we also have another type of bronchitis called acute bronchitis, okay? Now the difference between chronic versus acute, I'm just gonna explain it quickly over here. So chronic versus acute. Now this doesn't just apply to bronchitis, it applies to any disease you see, okay? If it's described as an acute disease or a chronic disease. So chronic usually is for a long period of time, okay? Long period of time. While acute is usually short period, okay? So it's short period. Now the difference is chronic is usually in small amounts but occurs over a long period of time, while acute it's a short period but the symptoms are really heavy, like it's really bad during an acute, but it lasts for a short time usually. Chronic, it's not that bad, however it lasts a long period of time, okay? And another thing that I want to mention to you guys, which is like a small trick or a small naming they use in the medical world. Anything that ends with itis, so itis basically, usually refers to inflammation. Okay, so as you guys guessed it, chronic bronchitis, we talked about the bronchi and the bronchioles in our first video. So bronchitis is basically inflammation, okay, of the bronchi. Another example, if I tell you meningitis is basically inflammation of the membrane in the spinal cord. So anything that ends with itis, that's basically inflammation, okay? So what happens in chronic bronchitis? We said it is the inflammation of the bronchi. Now, what is related to? Of course, related to smoking. So if you do smoke, I think it's time to stop. And we also mentioned the difference between chronic and acute. Now what happens? We have because inflammation, remember we said over here, smoke particles cause inflammation in our lungs. So there's an increased secretion of mucus. So inflammation of the bronchi, we have an increased mucus. And what happens also to our cilia? Remember cilia, what were cilia? Cilia were hair-like structures that flick around, okay, moving the mucus and trapping particles. Now we have what? Destruction of cilia and bronchitis. So destruction of cilia. So we can't move that huge amount of mucus that's going to be lined up outside and that's one of the symptoms that occurs because of bronchitis. Now, if you also look at emphysema, what is it? It's basically the enlargement of the alveoli, okay? And when did we say alveoli occurs? What happens in the alveoli? Gas exchange. So if I have a large enlargement of them, the gas exchange is not going to be as efficient anymore. Why? Because there's enlargement of the alveoli walls, okay? And then eventually those walls break. Now if these walls break, what happens when these walls break? Reduces the air spaces, reduces air spaces. So since we have less air spaces, we have a smaller surface area. Remember we said for gas exchange to occur efficiently, we must have a large surface area. However, here we're having a decrease in surface area, so gas exchange won't be as efficient. So what's going to happen? We're going to need to exert more energy just to breathe. So we're going to be having to put more effort than usual just to be able to breathe, because there's a decrease in surface area, gas exchange is not as efficient anymore. And of course, some symptoms of it are going to be fatigue and coughing. And just a note that it cannot be treated yet, okay? There is no cure for it, and it's also caused by smoking. So also caused by smoking, okay? And now we just have two more diseases, okay? They're very quick and we're going to be done with this video. So I'm just gonna erase over here so you guys can still see the other diseases that we spoke about, okay? So I'm going to be quickly talking about two diseases left. We have lung cancer, okay? And we have asthma. So in lung cancer, usually in every type of cancer, we have an uncontrolled cell division. So we have uncontrolled cell division, and this leads to the formation of tumors, okay? And what is one factor that can cause lung cancer? As we said, it is smoking. And why? Because tar, it contains tar, and tar is a carcinogenic compound, and carcinogenic compounds cause cancer in our body. And finally, we're going to be looking at asthma. What is asthma? Asthma is basically the narrowing down of air passageways. So basically, our bronchi and bronchioles, okay, they contract, and when they contract, not an enough amount of air is going to be able to pass through. That's why you find people with asthma, sometimes they get an asthma attack where you feel they can't breathe anymore. That's because their bronchi and bronchioles constrict so much that a very small amount of air can pass, even sometimes no air passes through, and that's why they feel like they're dying out of breath, okay? So it causes we have inflammation, also inflammation of the bronchi, which causes the constriction. So constriction of bronchi and bronchioles, okay, which causes breathlessness. So we're not able to breathe anymore, and it's triggered. How is it triggered by? So some people usually have allergies. However, sometimes it's triggered by air pollutants, and again, cigarette smoke. Which just makes me mention one more thing. So it's not only bad if you smoke, okay? There's also something called passive smoking. Now, what is passive smoking? Okay? Passive smoking is you're not directly smoking. However, you're in an environment that's surrounded by people who smoke. So all of those smoke particles that are released by them, you're breathing them in too. So we call that passive smoking, and that is also not good. Why? Because it can trigger asthma attacks, okay, where we feel that we are breathless, okay? That is let me just make sure that that's everything for today's video. Yep, it is everything for today's video. If you guys have any questions regarding anything that we've talked about today, please make sure to leave a comment for me and I'll try to be replying to everyone as soon as possible. Thank you guys for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and see you in our next video.